Welcome to this webinar on real estate holdings and legal entities hosted by Berkman Solutions. Your presenter today is Mark Little. Mark is a senior executive and corporate lawyer with over 20 years of experience in legal, compliance, and risk management technology. He has been a featured speaker and commentator on risk management and compliance around the world. Mark has led global teams and done business in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and North America. His expertise includes legal entities, contract authoring, commercial contract management, risk management, and compliance technologies. Today's webinar is being recorded. The video will be available for later viewing at berkmansolutions.com. Now, I'll turn it over to Mark.
Thank you for that kind introduction. This webinar on business entities and real estate investing will strive to accomplish three objectives. One, we want to look at the design of the corporate structure for real estate investing. Two, we want to visualize company organizational charts and explore the branches and relationships. And three, we want to see if there are ways that we can reduce risk through better legal entity data and document management. The webinar is really for any professional who is either advising or owning and operating businesses or investment platforms where real estate is a material component of the investment or business strategy. So it might be purely as a investment portfolio, or it could be a strategic who's owning and operating lots of facilities around the country, around the world, and anyone who is involved in that process that wants to understand how business entities, those legal entities that we create, can shape and grow the business as well as manage the risk. The overarching theme of this entire webinar is about improving risk management, because ultimately it's all about risk and return. What we'll see is that legal complexity is inevitable when it comes to real estate investing, that it is almost because it's become standard operating practice in number two that legal entities are essential to an effective risk management strategy. It's almost common practice now to create a separate legal entity for each property or facility, and then having those entities then owned in turn by investors or managers, and we'll see the mushrooming of that complexity. And it doesn't take many properties for that to become a fairly complex arrangement and generate its own set of risks right away. However, there's also a positive risk factor. That is that the legal structure can help accomplish our business and financial objectives. So that legal structure that we create not only is tamping down risk, but it's also opening up investment opportunities. We may see legal entities as a way to invite investors in who may want to participate in a segment of the portfolio. Maybe they're from a jurisdiction where we can create an entity that's more friendly to them and more appealing to them as an investment vehicle. And so we use our legal structure and those business entities in a proactive way to grow the business, not just to manage risk. So we'll explore this very basic portfolio, but one that we see in our experience can generate a lot of complexity, even on a small portfolio. So just in the interest of space, we'll focus on three properties. We'll begin with Uptown Modest Building, which is owned by Uptown LLC. Now, this wouldn't have to be an LLC. The type of legal entity is not really germane here, but what is germane is that we have a single entity owning this property to shield that risk. We have a second property, Downtown Grand Building, which is owned by Downtown Grand LLC. And finally, we have East Apartments LLC, which owns the East Apartment Building. So these three buildings make up our portfolio. And those entities are in turn owned by a company called Manager Member Co. And this not very creatively named entity is the primary business that's in focus, which is why it's green. So this is where we're going to focus our efforts in understanding the corporate organizational chart around this entity, because it owns all three of these and is sort of the first entity that is the common point between all three of these properties. So as we look at Manager Member, you'll see them in the center of our chart here in green. And down here at the bottom, we'll show all of our properties that we're managing along with that. And as we go through the webinar, we will explore various aspects of this organizational chart. And so we'll look at manager member in detail and bring their immediate parents and subs into focus. And we'll also explore other aspects and other branches of this organizational chart so that we understand what's going on in this organizational chart, what are the principles of laying it out, and then how does this effectively manage our risk. And then we'll explore all of those things that are common to each of these entities. Who are the boards of directors? How does the board work? How do we manage officers and directors across this entire portfolio? How do we manage organizational documents and other important legal agreements that might relate inside the corporate family? And then we'll look at all the sort of tasks and compliance obligations that may result from this kind of a structure. So welcome to this webinar. As we get started, we will explore those three themes and objectives of looking at the corporate structure, visualizing the organizational chart, and then improving our compliance and reducing our risk through better management of legal entity data. So let's start with company org charts. Corporate org charts are different from management org charts. Management org charts are pretty simple. They often have a single person, the president or CEO, whatever top official of a particular department or division, and then they form roughly a pyramid shape. It might be flatter, might be taller. There are matrices organizations that have permutations on this that might be more complex. But at the end of the day, there is generally a structure that flows up to a smaller and smaller group of people who are making large, long-term strategic decisions for the enterprise. In corporate org charts or legal entity org charts, that relationship is not necessarily there. In fact, often it looks more like two pyramids, each touching at the tip, and the top one is inverted. And we'll explore that in more detail. But it's important to keep in mind that we're talking here about business entity org charts and not management org charts. We'll cover three sort of specific topics that are unique to corporate organizational charts that are important to drawing and designing them, that will help us also think through some of the legal and business issues in our corporate structure. The first is that entities need to appear on the correct generational level. So because there isn't always a clear line of ownership from, a chain of ownership from one level to the next, we can get into some complex situations, and we'll look at some of those where the generations aren't entirely clear at first glance. The second thing is org charts must show generation skipping of ownership. And that's the principle that when we have someone that is several layers up in the organizational chart, that entity can own something directly straight through all the other entities below it and between it and the company that it ultimately owns. We'll see that visually in just a moment. And then finally, corporate structure needs to include both related and unrelated entities. And here there's a simple litmus test for what I mean by related and unrelated entities. An unrelated entity is any entity or person that is going to appear on the org chart where we have no responsibility for the ongoing compliance and filings and maintenance of that entity. So outside investors are the clearest example. We want them to appear on the org chart because they have an ownership relationship, but we're not responsible for managing their board of directors, their officers, their annual filings. Any of that sort of corporate hygiene is not our responsibility, but we still want them on the org chart. Related entities are all the entities that are in our corporate family where we do have that responsibility, where we do care about the board of directors appointments and officers, annual filings, permits, licenses, D&O insurance, all of that stuff that we'll look at later when we talk about legal entity data and documents. But that's the bright line between related and unrelated entities. And we'll see examples of that in just a moment. So we're back to our org chart. We still have manager member co in the center, highlighted in green as sort of the focus of our organizational chart. And this is also something that corporate organizational charts have, which is they start with a focus. What entity are we asking the question of? What's its corporate structure like? Now, in the case of a family office or an ultimate parent, the org chart might look very different. So if member manager were an ultimate parent or a family office, then everything would obviously be below member manager co because they're the ultimate parent. But in this case, member manager is somewhere in the middle, roughly, of our corporate family. And so they're going to appear thus in the org chart. Now, a couple things to point out about this organizational chart. And the first is this idea of generations. So we've highlighted just sort of 4 bands or 4 generations here, but each layer is a generation. I just want to highlight that we have this level up here and this level here, and then here, manager, member, co, and then there are some layers below that. And of course, we can highlight some of these others as well. But the point is that each entity appears on the right level. Now, what makes it the right level? Well, our first rule is that the direct owner should appear directly above the entity that it owns. So in this case, the Singh Family Trust owns directly some ownership interest. Could be, a 1%, it could be 100%. We don't know at this point, but they own some amount of manager member co. And so they're going to appear directly above manager member co. And so we've leveled them up into this area, and then they have a trustee. Now, admittedly, a trustee does not have an ownership relationship with the trust, but for purposes of our org chart, we wanted one to appear, so we added the trustee as an entity, even though it's probably a person, in here above this trust. But we also have over here in this part of the org chart, unrelated to the trustee, but coming down through another branch, we have Solar Partners LP, Brilliant Diamond Investors LLC, and High Tech Corp over here. So these entities are all in the same generational level in relationship to manager member. They are all grandparents, as it were. And then we can see that we have children of manager member, these subsidiaries down here, and then we have some further subsidiaries. Now, and generally, you're going to have the organizational chart is going to show them in a line. So you'll see that we have one entity on each, one layer of entity per generational line here. And they're all short but wide in their display. And that is the sort of the normal pattern for the best presentation of a corporate org chart. There are, however, exceptions. And so I want to highlight down here this bunch of 4 subsidiaries of Property Management Co. So Property Management Co. is right here. These 4 entities appear in this block because they are wholly owned subsidiaries of Property Management. So there's no one else that owns them. And they are all subsidiaries, and we're trying to optimize for space. So if we had to splay them out like we are on the other generational levels, then the org chart would be quite a bit wider because we're having to accommodate this space for them, but we can cluster them this way. This kind of grouping, these 2 T-shapes, will indicate that they are all 100% owned by property management. They are all subsidiaries of property management, and we can stack them up. And you could actually have these appear, a lot more of these. So if you had 6, 8, 12, they could all be clustered in the same way. It is also possible in more sophisticated org charts for there to be branching after one of these. So if Janitorial Services Company, for example, here had multiple subsidiaries, we could actually show and display those as a branch. Of course, the org chart would get wider to accommodate those, and we would level those properly, but you can combine this structure with this more horizontal structure as well if you need in that case. So a useful exception to maximize the display and balance both the height and the width of the organizational chart if you need to. We're also in this org chart showing both related and unrelated entities. So I want to draw your attention to the pension fund investment here versus the strategic company. So every entity in blue on here and in green are related entities. So they are all entities that we care about in some way. So we are managing the officers and directors. We are managing the organizational documents, any ongoing documents. We're handling all the filings related to those entities. They are an active part of the broader corporate family, as it were. The pension fund, however, here in gray, is an unrelated entity. So it might be providing outside capital and investing into one or more of the entities in our corporate family, but we have no responsibilities for it in any way. We're simply taking the investment funds. We want them to appear on the org chart because obviously their ownership will influence the rest of the corporate family, but they are distinct, and we're showing them that way. And so that's what this sort of, in this particular webinar, that's what we're showing here with this gray box. This is an unrelated entity, as it were. So those three things, the generations, occasionally you have exceptions to maximize space, and that you want to be able to show related and unrelated entities, are important design principles to keep the org chart consistent and orderly, but still dynamic and still built from the ownership data that is complex and always evolving over the history of the corporation, the corporate family. Now, finally, the last thing we want to do is sort of explore this idea of generation skipping as it relates to organizational charts. So to do that, we'll look at a particular example. So we'll look at property management. So property management is a subsidiary of Manager Member Co., which we looked at earlier. So they are one of those subsidiaries. And if I were to just go back just to make a point and show Manager Member Co., the direct parents of Manager Member Co. are all up here on this level. They're Highland Group, the Singh Family Trust, Sally Jones individually, Strategic Company, and the pension fund here are all showing ownership into Manager Member Co. And then it has 4 direct subs. Now, the entities we talked about at the very beginning, Downtown Grand LLC, Uptown LLC, and East Apartments LLC, of course, Manager Member owns. We identified it as sort of the principal owner of those entities, and it's the company that's sort of running this business. But now we've also discovered that it owns this property management firm. And it's not unusual in real estate investment portfolios for there to be entities that own the properties and then separate entities that are managing one or more aspects of the real estate business. And so that's what we're exploring with the property management company here. Now, as a matter of contract, it might be doing business with its affiliates. So it might be doing business with East Apartments or Uptown or Downtown Grand. It might even provide property management services completely outside of the corporate family. We don't really see that here, but those contractual relationships are not ownership relationships in this case. It is just one more subsidiary of Manager Member Co. and is part of our corporate family. However, unlike Manager Member Co., it has a different set of owners, and it is actually showing this idea of generation skipping. So obviously, Manager Member Co. is directly above it as a direct parent, but Sally Jones and Strategic Co. are also direct owners. So they each have a line into property management as a direct owner, but they are appearing above Manager Member. Why is that? That's because they own property management directly, as we're showing here, but also indirectly. They share a line with Manager Member Co. as its parents and subsidiaries. And because of that, they need to appear above it. So in order to show this relationship, if they were to appear down here with Manager Member Co., it would be deceptive. It would be difficult to discern at a glance whether or not they had a ownership interest in Manager Member. Now, being up here is no guarantee that they have an ownership interest in Manager Member, but it is certainly a much better clue than them appearing down here on the same level. So this is the idea of generation skipping. And the simple way to do that is to highlight the entities that are appearing, that have direct ownership, but leave them in place, not to redraw the org chart and bring them down, but leave them in place and simply display the entire corporate family, but highlight the direct relationships, which is what we're doing here. So in this case, property management also owns those entities we talked about in that T-shaped block here. So we have admin services. So in real estate, maybe this is an entity that's collecting the rent checks, servicing the bank accounts, whatnot. This landscape services might be providing landscape services for all of the buildings and even unrelated companies, as we mentioned. Janitorial services might be taking care of anything inside the building, and utility services might be taking care of anything telecom. Obviously, the property management company doesn't have to be organized with 4 separate subsidiaries. We simply do this to make the point that at any scale, large, complex, or more modestly sized portfolios, it does not take much for the corporate structure to become complicated. It is quite typical at any scale for there to be a separate property management firm, even if it's external. If it's not owned at all, it's just a contracted service. Obviously, it won't appear on the org chart. But if there's any ownership interest at all in the servicing company, the property management company, then it would appear on the org chart and needs to be represented in the proper position as well. And so as we're looking at this org chart, we can also explore it for other generation skipping relationships. Highland Group here, for example, will own, is one of the owners of manager members we talked about. It's also a direct investor in East Apartments LLC. So this is an example of one of those early principles where the organizational structure can open up investment opportunities. So it might be that the particular branch that owns Highland Group is more interested in residential real estate, multifamily properties, and so it is going to invest directly alongside with manager member and provide those funds as an investment vehicle for its owners directly into East Apartments. Contrast that with pension fund over here, which has a direct ownership relationship in manager member, but is also then investing directly in Uptown and Downtown Grand LLC. So the pension fund might, by contrast, have an emphasis on commercial real estate properties in urban areas, for example. But Highland Group up here has a different strategy, and we're showing that in its investment, linkages into East Apartments LLC only. And then we see it has a limited partnership, which in turn owns some of it. Brilliant Diamond Investors LLC and High Tech Corp owns some of it. And then we have a limited partner up here, B limited partner, and then the general partnership, which is going to be the general partner for this limited partnership. Again, this particular structure may or may not be useful or reflect the structure that you have. The point here is that regardless of entity type, regardless of jurisdiction, location of the properties, location of the entities, we can capture and accurately display an org chart consistently by implementing these principles of keeping the generations entities on the right generational level, showing generations skipping where necessary and not redrawing to show the proximity, keep the distance in the organization generation level, but skip the levels as necessary, and then highlight those when we keep an entity in focus. And then, of course, it's always nice to be able to explore the structure and highlight those for people in the organization that would benefit from this particular view. So that's org charts in a nutshell. Those principles will allow you to draw consistent, well-formed org charts for any branch or any segment of the corporate structure that you can want to then communicate with anyone else. So with that, let's go and take a look at some of the items beyond org charts. So for each of these entities, all of the blue ones, so again, if we're supposed to look at the entire corporate family, we have to manage all of the entities in blue. So they're all going to be in the corporate registry, except for the pension fund over here. These are all going to be in our corporate registry, and we have common issues for all of them. And so we're going to take a look at that now. Now, when we look at data management as a risk management strategy or as a tool to manage risk, there are 5 things I want you to focus on. So one is we have some common summary data for all of the entities. The second thing is, obviously, it's a document-intensive endeavor to keep legal entities in compliance. We'll keep all our documents together. We'll also track compliance obligations. The most obvious one will be annual statements or reports, but there will be others that we can look at. We'll look at the ownership data that help drives the organizational chart drawing. And then finally, we'll look at officers and directors and how do we manage officers and directors in the corporate family effectively. I'm just going to use LexTrade as an example to illustrate some of these points. We'll start with the corporate registry, and I will focus on the Highland Group, which is a New York corporation that was in our org chart. So this is the Highland Group. They have a legal address. They have a headquarters address in this particular example. Their jurisdiction of incorporation is New York. They are a corporation. We have an incorporation date. We have a little bit of additional metadata about them, which isn't really germane for purposes of our discussion. What we want to focus on are the legal documents relevant to Highland Group, the compliance requirements, ownership, officers and directors, and understand how we can use this data effectively to keep them in compliance and to get the full benefit of forming Highland Group Inc. in the first place. So the documents can be, there are many types of documents that are part of legal entity management in general. So one of the most obvious things is organizational documents. So you have things like bylaws, articles of incorporation. You might have an initial shareholder agreement or partnership agreement or membership agreement, depending on the entity type. But all the documents that were used to form the entity, you might want to keep in one place. You also might have, along with your documents, your D&O policies or E&O policies, or at least reference to them so that we know what their coverage and timing is. And one of the things you can do with that is set an expiration date for that D&O policy. So the D&O policy is obviously an important part of the risk profile for the entity. And if we set an expiration date, then we can generate notifications automatically so that we receive notice before the expiration of that D&O policy. That allows us to do two things. We can review the policy in advance. We can shop the policy and make sure that we're getting the best deal. And secondly, we can make sure it gets renewed and that this sort of pretty important coverage for our directors it stays in place as well. It's also quite common in entity management software to keep shareholder meeting minutes, board meeting minutes, committee meeting minutes in one place and along with this. And in that case, this is a fine place to do that as well. So broad range of legal entity documents are in one place. They're not scattered higgledy-piggledy everywhere. They're easily accessible, and they can drive notifications so that we can take action and keep the entity in compliance. But we can go a layer deeper too and actually schedule requirements. So in this example, we have an annual report. We're actually keeping track of our annual report filing. We see that we have this annual report. It's in New York. It's a filing. It is an annual report statement. We're just going to take a copy of that incorporation information we're already using. This is useful. Sometimes in some jurisdictions, entities file annual statements in multiple jurisdictions, in which case you would not want to copy it. You would want to capture the particular registration information for the second jurisdiction. Any details about that filing, its due date. And then what's important is you, obviously with this kind of a filing, you want it to recur. Now, annual reports are often filed annually, but they don't have to be. So that corporate registration in some jurisdictions might occur on a different frequency. It might be every 5 years or 2 years or what have you. You want to be able to capture whatever that recurring period is so that no one has to think about it anymore. It just is happening automatically. And then what's nice is if you're getting automatic notifications about those filings, those notifications will update automatically too. So 2 years later, when the registration filing is updated, the alerts will also get updated and they will start sending out so that when you have that downtown LLC company filing is due, you're going to get notifications from its jurisdiction of notifying you that that filing needs to be updated. And then, of course, sending that notification to anyone you want is really useful. So those requirements about annual reports are pretty straightforward, but it can also be anything else you need. So, for example, in real estate, we might have a special permit. So if we have a construction permit, as an example, and it's, we're doing some work in California maybe, and I want to say that this is a permit and this is a permit to build addition, whatever it might be. And then I can do any notes about that as well. And I can say that maybe the permit expires, at the end of June. And maybe it does recur, and it will recur for every maybe 4 weeks or so. And I can get a notification, or maybe I get a 1 year with it, and then I can send an alert, say, yes, notify me of that. I get a 1 year extension for that. And so I can add this as an additional requirement for that permit. So now I've added a requirement that is important for this real estate business because obviously we are engaging in some construction related to this property that it owns, and we want to make sure that that construction permit gets renewed if it needs to, or if it were to expire, we want to at least know about that and take action. Ownership data, we want to be able to capture the owners and subsidiaries. The nice thing about the organizational chart principles that we outlined earlier is that all you have to do is capture the direct owners and direct subsidiaries, and then your entity management software can build the entire chart dynamically from just that little bit of data, or at least should be able to. So people, officers and directors are vital to both the operation of the business as well as maintaining the corporate veil and those risk management benefits. When you have a complex corporate family and a real estate portfolio, it is common for certain people to serve on most or all of the boards or some of the boards, or to serve as officers and directors on different entities. We want to make that easy to create those assignments, and then we want to be able to see how many boards do they sit on, where are they an officer and a director. We also might want to capture terms of service. So we're going to take a look as an example. So let's say we have Connie Clive here is the chair of this particular board. We'll just take a look at Connie here for a minute. So she joined the board in April of 2009. If she were to come off the board, we could select the date that she comes off the board. And that would allow us to run a report to say who was on the board in 2012. And if we ran a report that said who's on the board in 2012, Connie would show up. So we could retrospectively see who made decisions that were important to some piece of property. This is especially useful in the case of real estate investing, where there might be some long tail liability risk that doesn't emerge immediately after the incident that caused the liability, but we want to know, we want to be able to look back and easily determine who were the officers and directors at the time of the event, and we can certainly do that if we're capturing their terms of service as well. And then once you've captured all those officers and directors for this one entity, now again, we're just looking at Highland Group here. So as we are looking at their officers and directors, we might ask ourselves, so let's take a look at Connie. What else is she sitting on? What other boards and officers? And we have a really quick and dirty way to do that. We can just come and say, Connie, where are you? And we see, oh, she's a director of this entity. She's a director here. She's an officer here. She has some other role here. And she's the chair and director of the Highland Group, Inc. And then we can even do fancier things by running a full report on her and others as well. But this is a nice, easy way to say, hey, what boards or officers is she, excuse me, what entities is she an officer or director on? So when you're able to capture all the officers and directors, all the ownership data, all the compliance requirements, and legal documents related to a particular entity, and you can do that easily for every entity in the org chart, the corporate structure and the legal entities that you form to protect your real estate investments also become an asset. That this is data now that is actionable, is efficient to create new entities, to assign officers and directors, to manage the risk profile of all of the entities so that you get the risk benefits that you expected when you formed those entities in the first place. You can always generate new charts. You can run reports and analyze your legal data across the entire corporate family, not just on an entity by entity basis. And that single breakthrough of having one entity management software solution opens up possibilities that don't exist but really need to when you have these complex web of relationships that are inevitable in a real estate investment portfolio. With that, I'd like to thank you for participating in our webinar today. We'd be happy to talk to you further about entity management software. You're welcome to contact us at any time, and keep your eyes open for the next webinar. Thank you.